Yeah, that's what I was asking.
They're coming. He told me he was coming.
But they better come.
Hey, Macha, do me a favor. Can you sign it for me?
Yeah.
I just got my guests out there. Got
Fine.
guests.
I can copy it to
No.
இடத்தில் எச்சரிக்கை மணி ஒலிக்கும். அவ்வாறான சந்தர்ப்பத்தில் எவ்வித பதற்றமும் அடையாமல் உடனடியாக அவ்விடத்தை விட்டு வெளியேறுவதற்கான
emergency, the fire alarm will be activated. In such an unlikely event, please leave the venue in an orderly side lawns. Thank you.
We have another Miththapala. Somewhat related, Sri Lanka is a classic resource to have. In Kumana, as we mentioned earlier, that's Shirley Perra, a former warden, so I think we've been fortunate to have lots of great personalities who lent us their time on these trips. Further, few more thanks to Dilma for all the tea and all the just a quick reminder on the rest of the month, 24th, we're having a media workshop. Again, because we see lots of big stories. If anybody wants to make a note of the hotline, 071 664. The subcommittees, whether it's cats or marine or conservation or, legal and things like that. But pushed back, so, we're quite happy that that piece of legislation didn't go through. We did our own part, and I want to assure you we are trying our hardest to make sure that these kind of legislations never see the light of day. Just that so that you get the most out of when you do get to that segment. Again in biology from Smith College, USA, and a PhD in wildlife and rain sciences from the University of Florida. Doctoral dissertation. She was trying to assess whether the 27 named leopard species, I believe a Russian scientist added one more, right? And some of this groundbreaking work is just picked up 2-3 extras because I have a couple of young kids who I'm pretty sure will love to get their hands on that. So slightly different route to some of the topics that you have heard us bringing to the table here, but I think equally important.
For the Ceylon Journal of Science, and it's trimmed severely and updated for this talk. If we look at the current situation of conservation, biodiversity conservation in Sri Lanka, we have some 35% of the land under some level of protection. we have some 30 organizations and 15 laws directly involved in biodiversity conservation, including the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, Forest Conservation Ordinance, and the National Environment Act. We have a wide range of ecosystems. We have a variety of species, many of which are endemic and found nowhere else in the world. Yet, we have habitat destruction, we have habitat degradation, we have pollution, we have overexploitation, we have the spread of invasive alien species, and we are already feeling the impacts of climate change. We have over 1,300 threatened flora and over 2,200 threatened fauna. The fundamental problem is, of course, that we have too many people in too small an area of land. Then there are issues like the fact that the Department of Wildlife Conservation, the Forest Department, and the Central Environmental Authority are not as effective as they could be. Laws are not implemented properly. There's political interference. And the Honorable Minister of Environment has other things on his mind at the moment. So, my opinion is that overlaying these issues is the problem that we do not understand the phrase biodiversity conservation. And this lack of understanding then hinders our conservation actions. So I will first go back to basics to clarify the definitions of biodiversity conservation. Based on the above, I will assess how we are faring in our conservation efforts in Sri Lanka. And finally, I will suggest what each of us can do to contribute to biodiversity conservation. In this talk, I will use biodiversity conservation and conservation interchangeably. So let's go back to basics to clarify the definition of biodiversity conservation. What is biodiversity conservation? Conservation International says it's protecting natural wealth, fostering effective governance, promoting sustainable production. The Convention on Biological Diversity says it is the management of human interactions with biodiversity to provide the maximum benefit to the present generation while maintaining the potential to meet the needs and aspirations of future generations. It encompasses save, study, use. In fact, I think Sriyan mentioned the events going on in Tulhiri at the moment, and the symposia are based on save, study, use. The Merriam-Webster dictionary says it's planned management of a natural resource to prevent exploitation, destruction, or neglect. IUCN and UNEP, while formulating the World Conservation Strategy in 1980, said conservation, like development, is for people. They continued to say, development aims to achieve human goals largely through the use of the biosphere. Conservation aims to achieve them by ensuring that this use can continue. Embedded in these definitions, firstly, is that humans are integral to conservation. The Convention on Biodiversity and IUCN and UNEP explicitly define conservation as the management of human use of natural resources. preservation, maintenance, enhancement, restoration, and sustainable use are all elements of conservation. At the one end of the scale, you have preservation, where you lock away an area and don't allow any form of use. Then you have maintenance, where you have a habitat or an ecosystem which you're maintaining at a certain ecological state. Then you have sustainable use, where you allow use as long as it doesn't damage the environment. At the other end of the scale, you have all the bad guys: overexploitation, habitat destruction, pollution, invasive alien species, and climate change. You can reverse some of, I'm going backwards. Reverse some of the effects of these, the far end of the scale, by engaging in restoration, managing use, or giving the environment or an ecosystem a little boost by engaging in enhancement. All that part that is green, is conservation. Preservation is not conservation. It's used interchangeably in Sri Lanka. In fact, as part of the advertising blitz carried out by Spencer Manuel Pillai, one of the papers carried a headline saying, Dr. Miththapala will speak on preserving Sri Lanka's natural wealth, even though they had been given the title. Preservation is an element of conservation, just as restoration, enhancement, and sustainable use are elements of conservation. Conservation requires management. There is no ecosystem or area anywhere in Sri Lanka, or in fact anywhere in the world, that is free of human presence. Professor Kotagama is famous for saying this. Even where you have preservation, like strict natural reserves under the DWC, where nobody is allowed to go in except with the explicit permission of the Director General of the Wildlife Department, you have to manage the borders. So we have to manage, we have to meddle. Not inherent in the definitions of conservation, but nonetheless important, are that ecosystems and their processes are not only complex and often unique, but also dynamic. This picture is a diagram of what I thought was a simplified food web of a wetland. See how complex it is. Ecosystems are never linear. A doesn't happen and therefore B happens and therefore C happens. There are loads of interconnections woven together like threads in a fabric. So if you break an interconnection somewhere, you might end up with something happening elsewhere, like when you pull a thread and a hole appears somewhere else in a piece of cloth or whatever you're wearing. that solutions to problems related to ecosystems must also necessarily be complex, and each solution unique. Each ecosystem is different. Because ecosystems are also dynamic and they're changing all the time, conservation efforts also for that ecosystem need to change, so that they must be adaptive. We also need to remember that most waste in ecosystems is recycled, and chemicals are continuously consumed, rearranged, stored, and used. Excuse me. Ecosystems exist within a mixed landscape, forming a mosaic of interconnected units. This is sort of a fanciful look of what a mosaic might look like. It doesn't really look like this. But you could get coral reefs, seagrasses next to each other, then the beach, sand dune, and beach vegetation behind. The implications for this is that if something happens you can't see that, can you? Is there a pointer? Okay. If something happens inland, the impacts may be felt in the coast. So, now that we've looked at the basics, let's see how we are faring. True conservation that is inclusive of all its elements is not practiced adequately in Sri Lanka. In management plans for several protected areas, much of the effort is focused on infrastructure management. Much less effort is put into looking at ecology and ecological processes. An excellent example of this are the elephants of Udawalawe, written up by Dr. Prithviraj Fernando in 2015. In the 1960s, logging and chaina cultivation artificially created a savanna ecosystem in Udawalawe. You can see the grasses and scattered trees, that's what we call a savanna. And elephants were driven into this area, and then a national park established in the 1970s. Another picture that shows the savanna. But the process of ecological succession was ignored. Ecological succession is a gradual process by which ecosystems change and develop over time. All of you, in fact, have seen this in action. When you have bare land, the first plants to colonize that area are herbs like Puppamania or Puppameni, grasses and sedges. Then you have bushes. Then you have small trees growing. And over time, you will end up with a forest or woodland. So in Udawalawe, the grassland turned into scrub forest, depriving the elephants of food. Also, the park was fenced, so the elephants couldn't go in search of food. The result was, as Dr. Prithviraj called it, the starving elephants of Udawalawe. A few months ago, I believe Dr. Pilapitiya spoke about the starving elephants of Lunugambehera. So in this example of, quote, conservation, unquote, we did not maintain the ecosystem. A recent paper by Ashoka Ranjiva and Dr. Fernando and his co-workers shows that the Udawalawe elephants look better in the dry season, because during the dry season, the reservoir dries up and grasses grow on the exposed riverbed, so reservoir bed. So, this was all over the papers. So now let's look at what everybody talks about, over-visitation in Yala and irresponsible behavior that comes with over-visitation. This is a young leopard killed by a speeding vehicle within Yala. In this example of conservation, we are allowing exploitation because visitation is a form of indirect use. We are not managing human use. So, we are allowing over-exploitation and not ensuring sustainable use. The bottom line is that we are not engaging in proactive, adaptive conservation. What is the overall goal for each protected area? What is it managed for? If we want to conserve the endemic birds of Sri Lanka, which are the protected areas we must conserve for that? What are the objectives we need to formulate? And then what are the conservation actions we need to develop in order to meet those objectives? We are not engaging in that sort of adaptive conservation, a proactive adaptive conservation. We do not monitor our management. We do not adapt our plans if something is not working. We are stuck in a loop of elephant sensors, erecting electric fences, repairing roads, repairing vehicles and buildings over and over and over again. We do not focus enough on landscape level conservation. Firstly, we are not paying attention from inland to the coast. You have Maha Oya there, and I don't think you can see those yellow dots. Maybe you can. In those areas, you get sand mining, with the result that on the coast, you have erosion. In the coast in Maravela, you have severe erosion. So, we are looking at one ecosystem or one protected area, and not looking from inland to coast. We are not looking across ecosystems. Secondly, we have fragmented forests and isolated protected areas. We have tiny little fragments of forests in lowland areas, in the lowland wet zone. And this results in fragmented populations of species. With that, keeping that in mind, let's look at two iconic species. the leopard is found in tiny little fragments. I really need a pointer. Tiny little fragments in the central highlands, if you can see over there, and in lowland rainforests. Just 5 square kilometers large. And you can see that many of them are outside protected areas. This is a map from Dr. Andrew Kittle and Anjali Watson, Miss Anjali Watson. You must have heard about this from Dr. Prithviraj himself. This is a map of elephant distribution in Sri Lanka. The white areas are where there are people and no elephants. The green area are where there are no people and elephants. And the blue areas are where there are both people and elephants. It's a stark picture of the reality of the fact that elephants are outside protected areas. So both these iconic species need a landscape approach. Where possible, we need to connect fragmented areas. But we need to do this using science-based knowledge. In 2017, Professor Devaka, who is somewhere around here, Dr. Prithviraj Fernando and I were part of a large team assembled by IUCN who worked for the Mahavalley Authority to provide environmental mitigation measures for the Northwest Canal project. And Dr. Prithviraj, using his knowledge of radio-collared elephants, was able to show, I don't know how to use this, I hope I do. Well, it's not working. Anyway, what? Sorry. What am I not pressing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's see. Which one? The red one?
The red, yes.
Oops. Okay. I can't see the dot. That's the point.
Shall I use the finger?
It's okay. I get up. Tank around the Galgamur tank to the Galgamur teak forest. You can see they're moving here. So that's where he proposed a corridor. This is exactly how corridors should be developed. Not looking at a map and saying maybe this is a good area to connect to patches of forest. The third thing is that humans are largely ignored till after the fact. Sorry. If you look at this map, the right side is from the survey department. It's land use, and the the browns and yellows and pinks are either human presence or human cultivation, plantations, etc. And the left is a map of protected areas of the DWC and the Forest Department prepared by IUCN. And if you overlay it, you see that humans are living, the protected areas are in a sea of humans around them. So villagers living around protected areas bear the full brunt of an elephant close by or a leopard close by. But we deal with that after the fact. Dr. Prithviraj is working with one village at a time, to fence people in. We call them village fences. And their cultivations, paddy field fences. And this makes sense, and it is working. Dr. Andrew Kittle and Miss Anjali Watson are working on human leopard conflict in the hill country especially, by using their knowledge and protocols, and giving protocols to people about what they should do if there's a leopard prowling close by. So they know what the response is, sort of like an early warning system. They're also using their knowledge of where leopards are and how they move to negotiate with tea estate owners and owners of land in the hill country to try to get corridors, sort of private corridors established. So this leads into the next point. Most of the time, something went wrong there. Did I kick something?
The cable.
Okay, I kicked the cable. Okay. Most of the time, we do not consider communities living around protected areas as being integral to solving conservation-related problems. The challenge for conservationists is that although people cause the problem, necessitating conservation, people causing the problem must be part of the solution. We have a tendency to talk about those jeep drivers. Ayyo, those villagers killed the leopard, no? Yes, the jeep drivers of Yala are unmanageable, but there are other jeep drivers in other national parks whom you can bring to the table. Rohan Vijay with the Department of Wildlife Conservation and the Tourism Authority is doing just that. And others, I think EFL also did some work with jeep drivers. And others are planning future programs. We can discuss visitor satisfaction with them and facilitate a conversation with them about solutions. We still have a tendency to present a solution to them in a top-down fashion. When Dr. Fernando works with villagers and using village fences, the communities themselves erect the fences and maintain them. So therefore, the ownership is theirs. Now, there's an emerging trend of working to sustain environmentally sensitive areas outside the protected area system. Here, a method is being developed to manage sensitive areas with people in them. So we may just change here. We do not focus outside protected areas. We really have blinders on. There are loads of areas like abandoned prawn farms that can be restored. We do engage in restoration, reforestation. We have a great tamasha. We print t-shirts, we print badges, we transport loads of villagers, plant thousands of seedlings, and then forget about it. So the survival rate of those plants is very, very low. Reforestation or restoration is a process. It's not an event. A textbook example of reforestation is Mausakanda. You must have heard about it last month. Mr. and Mrs. Ellawala owned a 20-hectare plot of rubber plantation, and when the trees became non-productive, they decided to let it revert to a natural forest. They called in biologists from IUCN who planted native species, who monitored growth, monitored species, and now it's a thriving, growing rainforest. Even where there's a heavy human footprint, like in cultivated areas, if you engage in practices like organic gardening, sustainable agriculture, when you don't use chemical fertilizers, when you use soil conservation measures, beneficial insects, natural predators, beneficial soil organisms come in, and then you start having interconnections as in ecosystems, even in an artificial system like this. We are not negotiating with decision makers in a way that is convincing to them. This is the way that we communicate with each other most of the time. When we want to communicate with non-biologists, we say, save the whales, save the forest, frogs are our friends. We have been bleating these same refrains for the last 3 decades. A decision maker may ask, why save our forest? Frogs are what? There are people living in poverty. I have to develop this area. So we need a new way of communicating to decision makers about the urgency of conservation action. And in 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment gave us just that. It took the benefits that ecosystems give us, like food and fresh water, absorption of carbon, amelioration of climate, etc., and call them ecosystem services. You are using an ecosystem service as you listen to this talk. You are breathing in oxygen made by green plants. The replenishment of oxygen on Earth is a service provided by ecosystems. They listed these ecosystem services on one side, and then they listed the constituents of human well-being on the other. I'm not presenting that slide because it's a very detailed slide. It takes a long time to go through. And they connected the benefits from the ecosystem services to human well-being. In a nutshell, they said, if you conserve ecosystems and to ensure their well-being, in effect, you are ensuring human well-being. So now we had a way of talking to decision makers. We could value these ecosystems in terms of rupees. If you take the value of fish and shellfish in Batiklo, Nigambu and Putlam lagoons, the value in 2019 is well over 2,500 million Sri Lankan rupees per annum. The value of flood protection that Muthurajavela Marsh gives us, again in 2019, is over 1,500 million Sri Lankan rupees. Mangroves in Puttlam absorb carbon at a value of 293 million rupees, Sri Lankan rupees per annum. The revenue of entry tickets into Singharaja is nearly 9,000 million Sri Lankan rupees. That's good. That's excellent. But the total value of Singharaja is far, far more. From that huge canopy of leaves, there is a huge value of absorption of carbon. There is flood protection value, a huge value for flood protection from the fallen leaves on the ground. Then there is the non-timber forest products like Kitul. Then there are the earnings from guest house owners and hotel owners. And the exchange receipts from tourism. And remember, tourism is the third largest foreign exchange earner for Sri Lanka. There are other multiple uses here, also non-use values, like for example, the intrinsic value of the blue magpie in Singharaja. So the aggregate value is much, much more. And we are now able to report on these values. There's a lot to be done, but this kind of valuation is slowly increasing in Sri Lanka. There's still a hurdle of actually convincing people that conservation can actually make sense, economic sense in your day-to-day lives. But here suddenly we have a tool to use to communicate with decision makers. Like conservation, research on ecosystems and species must also be proactive. We are not doing enough applied and predictive research. We have more than 100 new fauna species described and upgraded to species level since 2007. This is exceptional. But applied studies about the ecology and behavior of species in order to understand what threatens them, as well as predictive research, have not kept up in parallel with taxonomic research. We're not doing enough subpopulation studies. Remember I talked about mosaics, ecosystems in a mosaic. You might have subpopulations in those different ecosystems or in fragments of forests. Sorry, an excellent example was given to me by Dr. Michael van der Putten, who said that when you use excessive nitrogen fertilizers, which run off into streams, nectar-bearing plants on the banks of these streams cannot tolerate the nitrogen, so they die off. And more resilient grasses grow instead. And butterflies who rely on the nectar from those plants, once abundant in that area, have now become less abundant. So this is a very good example of what can happen, because you have less abundance and then you have less abundance, and suddenly the population can you can have a local extinction. These are the examples he used of the peacock pansy and the grey pansy. And this is also an excellent example of what I talked about earlier of the interconnections. The thread is broken somewhere, but the problem happens somewhere else. There was no direct threat to butterflies here. We are not doing enough habitat suitability modeling with environmental variables of the area where a species is found to predict where it could be found. I'm not saying it's not been done, I'm saying we are not doing enough. See this example from Dr. Lal Muthuatta's student, Janaka Pereira, who has carried out predictive modeling on the Sri Lanka magpie. He used 18 variables, and you see here the red, orange and brown areas are where the habitats are most suitable for this bird. So obviously we need to put in a lot of conservation effort in those areas. We have hardly enough any research on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. Climate change, as we all know, is the biggest and most insidious threat facing ecosystems and species. Research has been carried out predicting the climate changes in Sri Lanka, examining the impacts of climate change on natural hazards, predicting the impacts of climate change on agriculture. Very little has been done on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. In Sri Lanka, it is in the montane zone that climate change impacts are already being felt. A climate change vulnerability analysis of the montane zone is being carried out by the Climate Change Secretariat, supported by the ADB. And they have found that both minimum nighttime temperatures and maximum daytime temperatures are increasing, and there are changes in rainfall patterns with periods of dry areas. So this will have profound impacts on flora and fauna of that area, which are adapted to the cold and wet. Montane forests are the home are the home of about 500 endemic plant species, and 50% of all those endemic plants, and 50% of all the endemic plants of Sri Lanka. 41.5% of all orchids,